And we have the biographer of Mr. Armstrong covering the later career in his first volume, then the swinging big band era in his second, and he just completed the early years, I understand, going to press with it. Ricky Riccardi, welcome to WPFW.
Hey, Rusty, so happy to be here.
Well, good to have you. And you're the hardest working person I know, working on these volumes of biography, curating, doing everything at the Armstrong Museum, and teaching courses, and having a wonderful family life along with it, and I know how important that is also. Boy,
I'm a lucky man. That's all I can say.
Well, I'm just in awe how you produce, how you write so well and so detailed with the facts, and do it so quickly. You know, I am just amazed. So you're working on his early years now. Did you get it completed?
It is complete. It is right now in my editor's hands, and she's going over it, and it has to go through the peer review process. Then I'll have one more shot to polish it up a little bit, but it's looking like in 2025, early 2025, the 100th anniversary of the first Hot 5 recording session.
Okay, wow.
I'll publish Stomp Off, Let's Go, the early years of Louis Armstrong, and that will complete my backwards trilogy.
Absolutely, it was amazing. Now your approach was to look at the later years that used to get put down by the jazz police, so to speak, saying, well, his greatest years were up from 1933, et cetera, which is BS, to say it politely. But you covered very well those later years as your first volume, and what made you do it that way?
Well, those were the years that changed my life. I mean, much like you, I was a 15-year-old, and I stumbled across a compilation of Armstrong's 1950s Columbia recordings, all produced by the late, great George Avakian, Ambassador Satch. Louis Armstrong plays W.C. Handy, Satch plays Fats. And that one compilation completely changed my life. And I said, well, this guy, Louis Armstrong, for the listeners who don't know, I was born in 1980. So when I say 15, I'm talking 1995.
Right.
And at that time, I said, this guy, Louis Armstrong, is the greatest figure I've ever heard. Let me read more about him. And I kept on bumping into this narrative, like you mentioned, that he kind of trailblazed and pioneered in the 1920s, and then he became a sellout and commercial, and, he's rolling his eyes and singing Hello, Dolly, and wasting his great talent. And when I was in high school, I kept saying, no, people are missing something, because the music in this period is stunning. But then, he's also Ambassador Satch. He's this global icon. He's also standing up for civil rights and putting his career on the line and saying the government can go to hell. And, he's knocking the Beatles off the charts. So, what a story. And that was the book I always wanted to write. And so I started it in college. I got a master's in jazz history and research at Rutgers, and I started working for the Armstrong House in 2009. And that book came out in 2011. It's called What a Wonderful World, The Magic of Louis Armstrong's Later Years. And at that point, I thought I had accomplished everything I had set out to
right.
accomplish.
Absolutely.
So that's the one book I wanted to write. I can retire now. And then as the years went on, I started giving more lectures, and I started teaching more classes, and I started meeting more musicians, and I realized, wait a minute, the first book did a good job in rehabilitating 1947 to 71, but what about the swing era? I had heard so much that Louis was recording commercial junk, and his bands were out of tune, and he's making these horrible movies and all this kind of stuff, and I said, well, let's roll up our sleeves. And so I went back to the source, and I consulted the African American newspapers, Baltimore Afro-American, Chicago Defender, Pittsburgh Courier, and I found out, so wait a minute, starting in 1929, Louis Armstrong becomes the first black pop star, and how he has to do it, navigating gangsters and racism and all this stuff. I said, that's a story. And so I wrote Heart Full of Rhythm, which came out in 2020, and that tells the story of 1929 to 47. And so I feel good. I feel very proud of those books, and I feel like those periods in Armstrong's life have been properly reevaluated. And so the one book that I didn't think I needed to write was the early years, because he wrote the definitive book about growing up in New Orleans, Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, and then everybody knows the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm glad I did it backwards, because in recent years, there's been a whole new slew of new sources, old interviews, oral histories, digitized sources, Ancestry.com, you name it. And I've been able to tap into so much new research that I think I've had a few of my close Armstrong friends read the manuscript, and they said, "My goodness, there's something new on every page."
Good,
so,
that's fantastic. It's always important that, hey, if a new volume comes out of somebody covered, that new things come out. I guess it was back, in the 70s when it was revealed from a baptismal certificate, his actual birth date of August 4th.
That was in the 1986 or 7. Late Tad Jones in New Orleans discovered the baptismal certificate.
Wow.
So there's always new discoveries, and I'm sure 50 years from now there'll be even more. But I'm excited that it kind of played out this way, and I'll have a lot of new theories and a lot of new information. The last thing I want to do is just rehash the same old story, saying this one's a page turner. And so my trilogy will be complete, but I still think we're kind of at the beginning of this renaissance in interest in Armstrong, and I think there'll be scholars and biographers and musicologists for generations to come who will be studying every aspect of this guy's life.
Wow. I did a post-performance discussion about Terry Teachout's play about Louis Armstrong at, I can't think of the exact name of the play.
Satchmo at the Waldorf.
Right. And there are certain issues, but it was really funny because I had the conversation with an Ellington scholar, Patricia Willard. And so we got to, kind of put things in perspective, because she had some dealings with, what was his name, Morris Levy?
Joe Glazer.
Joe Glazer, right. Boy, I'm all these producers and agents and stuff like that. Yeah, Joe Glazer was the two-character play and the relationship. But your book really gets into how that relationship started. And both books really cover the importance of and the dynamic of it, and not to sensationalize it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I think on the surface, and I'm the first to admit that Joe Glazer is a complex figure. He is not the hero in the story, but he's also not the villain that people make him out to be. Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of thing where people on the surface, especially now in the 21st century, it looks like white gangsters sitting in the office counting the money while the African-American genius is pushing himself 300 nights a year and not making as much money and all that kind of stuff. But in actuality, Louis was the boss. Mm-hmm. He controlled, everything. If he wasn't happy, he would curse off Glazer. He was not afraid to let him know at any time that he could be replaced, and Glazer had to make sure that Armstrong was happy. And the way to do that was to give him peace of mind. So in my book, Heart Full of Rhythm, I discussed Louis and the Gangsters, and he was held at gunpoint. He had mobsters waiting for him in his dressing room. He couldn't go to New York. He couldn't go to Chicago, and he had money, but he had to look over his shoulder every night. And then Glazer came in, and he had these connections, and he made a few phone calls. And so at that point, they shook hands, and Louis said, "Listen, you're going to pay me a salary every week, and the rest of it, pay my taxes, pay the band, mm-hmm. book the band, do the publicity." And for the last 36 years of his life, Armstrong had peace of mind. And he died a millionaire, and Glazer died a millionaire. So,
right.
So it's the kind of thing where, it's a relationship that might not fly in 2023, but it was the reality of the times. And even Lucille Armstrong, who at first wasn't quite sure what to make of this relationship, after both Louis and Joe Glazer had both passed away, and she was safe to say whatever she wanted, she said that they were truly best friends. They were like brothers.
Wow.
So,
mm-hmm.
It's a really interesting dynamic.
Absolutely. During this era now of people trying to revise history, and since the current governor of Arkansas is trying to act a revision about Orville Faubus, could you tell us a little bit about what Louis Armstrong did when the Little Rock Nine were trying to enter Central High School, and Orville Faubus had the National Guard blocking their entry, and Armstrong was interviewed. You tell that story so well. If you could repeat it again.
I think it's the defining kind of civil rights story from Armstrong's career, because especially in 1957, earlier in that year, he had played Knoxville, and like basically an offshoot of the Klan, the White Citizens Council, threw a stick of dynamite at the auditorium because Louis had an integrated band, and it was, this was the kind of stuff he was dealing with, but he was also being criticized. There was the rumors of Uncle Tom, and he's smiling and all this kind of stuff, and here comes Little Rock, where Orville Faubus, governor of Arkansas, sends in the state National Guard to prevent the 9 African-American high school students from integrating Little Rock Central High School. And this goes on for weeks, and Eisenhower's not doing anything, and every day it's on the news. There's these mobs of white people outside the school spitting, cursing, screaming at these 9 black students. And finally, Armstrong, he is in Grand Forks, North Dakota, doing an interview in his hotel room with a student reporter named Larry Lubenow. And Lubenow was anxious to kind of ask Armstrong about this, but he kind of snuck into Armstrong's room and was asking him kind of vanilla questions. Who's your favorite singer? What's it like to work with Bing Crosby? But he noticed that Armstrong was glued to the TV. And he said, do you have any comments about Little Rock? And Louis erupted, and he said, the way they're treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell, and Eisenhower has no guts to let Faubus run the country, and he called Faubus a couple of 12-letter epithets.
Absolutely.
And right. So Lubenow had this scoop, and his editor refused to believe that this actually happened. So Louis had to sign off on the story, and it was front-page news, and you have to, go back in that time in the 50s, all entertainers, black and white, were supposed to be patriotic and support the government. And, here's Louis Armstrong, arguably the most famous American musician, famous black musician, and he's saying that Eisenhower has no guts and the government can go to hell. And so there were boycotts, and, he was criticized all up and down, but it worked, because less than a week later, Eisenhower sent in the Airborne Division to escort the 9 African-American students in, and a lot of people say it was Louis Armstrong who did that. And, today there's books been written about it, and documentaries and stuff, but at the time, I think he was more hurt than anything, because a lot of musicians did not, back him up. They were too afraid to put their careers on the line. And he was criticized by Sammy Davis Jr. and Adam Clayton Powell. They said, oh, don't listen to Louis Armstrong. He's not up on current events. And Armstrong said, I might not be up on current events, but I'm up on head whooping. So,
wow.
And he doubled down. He didn't back down. His road manager tried calling the Pittsburgh Courier and saying, "Oh, Louis is sorry. He spat it off. He didn't really mean it." And Louis picked up the phone and said, "I wouldn't take back a thing I said." And so, anybody who's still clinging to those beliefs that he was, not political, or he was just, there to make white people happy. Just study Little Rock, study, the kinds of sacrifices he had to make, and the barriers he broke down, and you'll really get a different picture.
Absolutely. Well, you're doing a Thinking About Jazz session. This is a reprise of what you did. How many years ago was that? About 10 years?
I believe that was a decade ago.
Wow. It was a wonderful, doing a phone interview and then meeting you in person at the church. Brian Hamilton and Dick Smith are really doing it with Westminster Church with the music program that they have, and they are now, since COVID hit, put the Thinking About Jazz sessions on Zoom, which allows you to be able to do it and not have to do any travel or anything like that. But with the Zoom session Saturday at 1:00, what are you going to be talking about in terms of the vast career that Armstrong had?
This one, I am going to try to cover everything, which is impossible. Right. But I'm kind of calling it like a Louis Armstrong 101. I think sometimes it's kind of good to go back to the basics.
Sure. And
even if you're a diehard Armstrong fan, I promise I have a few surprises up my sleeve. But I'm going to cover New Orleans, going to cover King Oliver, We'll talk West End blues. We'll talk about the big band years. I've got lots of footage. We'll see him in Denmark. We'll see him in Africa. I'll cover the Little Rock stuff. We'll talk about Hello Dolly. We'll talk about the Armstrong House in Queens. And, I think by the end, it's going to be all like a multimedia explosion. You'll hear Louis. You'll see him. It'll be a lot of fun. And like I said, if you're a diehard fan or if you're just kind of curious and just kind of getting into it, there'll be something for everyone. And it's good to be reminded every now and then about this man's importance to the 20th century and beyond. Absolutely.
Well, speaking of the Armstrong House, there's a new building across the street. Tell us about it and what's happening there.
This has been a very exciting summer, years in the making. The Louis Armstrong House Museum opened to the public in 2003, and that's the house in Corona, Queens, where Louis and his fourth wife, Lucille, lived for the last 28 years of their life together. Then Lucille passed away in 1983, and the house was taken over by Queens College. And like I said, the house opened as a museum in 2003, but around that time, there was an empty lot across the street. And the Armstrong Estate, the Louis Armstrong Educational Foundation, they actually bought the lot and gave it to Queens College. Wow. And the late Michael Cogswell, who was our founding executive director, he started talking about it in 2004, 5, 6. One day, maybe that could be our visitor center, and that could be the new home of the archives, and we can have an exhibit space. And they started raising the money, and putting together a building like this. There's just so many delays and craziness, and then the pandemic hit, and one thing after another. But we finally opened on July 6th, which was coincidentally the 52nd anniversary of Louis's passing.
Wow!
And what it is a state-of-the-art building. The archives have moved back to Corona. They've been at Queens College since 1991, but they now occupy the second floor. That's my domain. And the first floor has an exhibit that was curated by Jason Moran. You'll see one of Louis's trumpets. You'll see his Grammy. You'll see a bunch of things. There's also an interactive touch table where the archives have been completely digitized. You can spend an hour at this table watching footage, listening to audio. There's a new gift shop. There's a 75-seat performance room. We're going to be doing monthly concerts. The first concert's coming up on September 9th, and it's going to be Jason Moran with Ambrose on trumpet and a whole all-star little group there. And so it's incredible. And once you buy a ticket, you can still walk across the street and take a guided tour of Louis Armstrong's house. And so if anybody deserves this kind of treatment, it's Louis Armstrong. I think it's something that's kind of unique in the jazz world, and I hope some of his other fellow, founding fathers and legends and everybody else can get that treatment one day. But it's our little version of Graceland. You can visit louisarmstronghouse.org, book a tour in advance. Right now we're open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And, it's a real destination. We've got international visitors who come straight from LaGuardia Airport. We're only about 10 minutes away from the airport. And, like I said, it's what Louis deserves. I think it's what he always wanted. And it's all right there on 107th Street in good old Corona, Queens.
That's fantastic. It's really, I'm really glad that you pulled in Jason Moran to curate stuff. He's done that type of thing that I interviewed him about years ago in terms of replicating performance space and things like that. Wow.
Yeah, Jason has a great eye, and the timing, as unfortunate as the pandemic was in so many ways, it was a good timing for Jason because, he's on the road all the time, plus his duties with the Kennedy Center and all that. And we hired him in January 2020, and when the world shut down, he was able to really focus his attention on Armstrong. And I think he was always a lifelong admirer of Armstrong, but he had not really explored the depths. And once he started listening to the tapes and looking at the collages and the photographs, he came to truly understand, the man, his music, his times, and he really wanted to tell the story properly. And he did a beautiful job in curating the exhibit. And like I said, you can see the reel-to-reel collages. That's actually what I talked about when I was at Westminster 10 years ago, and we now have a bunch of them on display. And it's a beautiful, beautiful exhibit, and we've been at capacity every day. Every tour has been sold out, and so definitely, if you're listening right now and planning on coming to New York, definitely stop by the Louis Armstrong House Museum. and the Louis Armstrong Center.
Well, this is just awesome, Ricky. I'm really thrilled that we've had this conversation, man. It's been a real treat. Again, this is all connected with Jazz Night at Westminster. Tomorrow night will be a tribute to Louis Armstrong with Thad Wilson on trumpet, Paul Carr playing the sax, Paul Bratcher piano, Steve Novosel on bass, and Lenny Robinson on drums. And then Ricky Riccardi doing the Zoom session on Saturday at 1 o'clock. And if you go to westminsterdc.org, westminsterdc.org, the website, and click into the jazz program, hopefully they'll have up a link to it. If not, go to the church tomorrow, and Brian Hamilton and Dick Smith will tell you how to hook into the Zoom session Saturday at 1 with Ricky Riccardi, with a good overall history of Louis Armstrong. Well, I'm going to kick off the set of Armstrong with the Louis Armstrong plays W.C. Handy's version of St. Louis Blues, and then go back a few years before I get out of here at midnight. But, Ricky, it was so great to talk with you tonight. It was really a thrill to have this conversation.
Always a pleasure, Rusty. Anytime you need a little sprinkling of Armstrong, you know where to find me. And man, St. Louis Blues, that's the track that changed my life when I was 15. So good
boy,
choice.
Jesus. George Avakian, I got to meet him at an couple of Ellington conferences back in the early 2000s, and spent some time with him in Stockholm at an Ellington conference there. What a delight to meet and talk with him. And I know you had a great time putting the material together for the Mosaic collection, for both Mosaic collections, I'm sure.
Yeah, that was a dream come true, because, like I said, George's music, his recordings changed my life, and then I got to know him, and really we became very close in the last decade or so of his life. And both of those Mosaic sets are now out of print, but that was kind of our tribute to George and Louis. The first one is streaming.
Boy, well, again, extensive liner notes separate from what you've written in the books. Oh, man, I'm just in awe, that's just fantastic. I've got to meet a lot of my heroes over the years, so I feel really blessed at my age when, I'm old enough to be your dad. But being part of this and being connected with someone like you, that's such a part of the music, it's been a real thrill.
No, the feeling is mutual.
Great. Well, thanks for calling in tonight. It's been a delightful conversation. Again, 1 o'clock Zoom session on Louis Armstrong. Ricky Riccardi, thanks again for calling.
Thanks, Rusty. See you on Saturday.